Over 10 years ago, people first experienced the intensity of making it to Extract, and today, that experience has evolved and exploded in ways no one could have predicted. Love it or hate it, this genre is everywhere, from moments of heart-pounding intensity to unscripted cinema to light-hearted adventures, and with player counts dethroning once untouchable AAAs, the impossible has happened. The extraction shooter genre has gone mainstream. But this did not happen in a vacuum. Decades-old foundations of game design going all the way back to the beginning. They're the DNA from which this current era of games was built. Here's how a once-thought impossible genre stumbled its way to the top. This is the entire history of the extraction genre. But first, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, Opera GX, and you can use my link to download Opera GX today in the description. When you launch a new game, what do? Do you go in blind? No, you optimize your settings how you want, and that's what Opera GX is all about, customization. With a whole mod workshop with specially curated wallpaper, sounds for keyboard clicks, opening and closing tabs, background music, fonts, and shaders for your favorite games or media to totally immerse yourself in whatever theme you want, or using the mod menu, you can just quickly enable or disable whatever. A huge one for me is the ability to purposefully throttle Opera's RAM usage in the background. You have no idea how much memory your browser is using, so get those FPS back in game with the switch of a button. You can also automatically tell Opera to clear your cache or cookies. Again, whatever you want. It's all about freedom to use your browser the way that's best for you. Oh yeah, they have a built-in ad blocker and VPN as well. No more proprietary programs needed for a smooth experience. Make sure to use the code EGGPLANT on the website through the end of 2025 for a free month of the VPN Pro version, by the way. And lastly, Opera GX just got smarter with the seamless integration of ChatGPT. Need to find an item or a guide in-game on the fly? Get a quick summary of the info right away, or pop open the most pertinent article or video with just a single click. So stop using boring internet browsers and get Opera GX right now using my link in the description or pinned comment today. And thank you again to Opera GX for sponsoring this video. Most would cite Escape from Tarkov as the start of the extraction trend. Those who know would point towards Tom Clancy's The Division. But the DNA goes back decades before the online games we know today, before the internet itself. In 1978, Richard Bartle created MUD 1, or the Multi-User Dungeon, while at Essex University. Characters could move between locations, rooms, using cardinal directions. They could perform actions such as get longsword, get diamond. The game featured permadeath. If you were defeated in combat, you would lose your inventory of items, and you could fight other players. That's right, the first multiplayer role-playing game of all time, predating the internet, had PvP. But with PvP comes pain, comes frustration from players who don't wish to engage in it.
Oh, there's a guy. Yeah, right here, right here.
I don't even have an HP bar anymore. You're right.
No, he's got to be loaded though.
Should we just kill him?
He came from all these bodies. He's so loaded.
Are you guys going out? Or?
Where?
I can't believe you.
In the 1990s, MMOs like EverQuest and Ultima Online struggled with balancing that dilemma of PvP. You need new players to play your game, you need them to keep playing your game. But getting stopped and losing your stuff out the gate to no-lifers with hundreds or thousands of hours, not much fun, is it? How do you retain that intensity and reward that PvP provides while not ruining the experience for those who are killed without their consent? Well, in a 2001 article on the subject, Richard Bartle suggests a solution. The Badlands, he calls them, an unsafe or PvP on zone within the safe PvP off overworld. A zone that contains rewards that can't be found elsewhere, and opt-in to permadeath by player kill. Every time you enter, you're risking everything. Sound familiar? Fast forward past the era of online MMOs, past the era of open world survival to 2016's The Division, and specifically its Dark Zone. Like these Badlands Bartle described in 2001, the Dark Zone is very specifically a temporary location. Anything found in the zone is contaminated, it needed to be extracted, and until you leave yourself, you're free game. A degree of permadeath, a cordoned location, extraction of materials, and a ticking clock. These ideas all began to come together right here. But that same year, they solidified in a place that needs no introduction. When Tarkov was first shown to the public, its RPG influence was likely not the first thing that audiences noticed. Potions, enchantments, and legendary weapons became tourniquets, medkits, military-grade stimulants, Soviet bloc surplus ammunition, and ballistic plating. Status effects like bleeds, broken bones, destroyed limbs and organs, They all made that same experience of entering the PvP zone under a ticking clock feel more horror than adventure. And unlike in The Division, there were no rules. You were on your own. Cooperate or don't, stab each other in the back, get revenge, or sneak your way to extract with a bag full of the very things required to fuel your next outing. Tarkov immediately felt like something new, a harsher, colder vision of a virtual world defined by necessity. And thus, while we didn't know it yet, the extraction shooter genre was truly born. But that term wouldn't exist for years. Tarkov, off the heels of Arma, was just another flavor of Battle Royale to many who first witnessed it, albeit a harder, more punishing version. Vigor, launching into early access in 2018, was seen similarly. Its encounters are clearly reminiscent of a Tarkov or DayZ-like experience. Enter an area, search for loot needed to upgrade your base, and get out. But other elements like guaranteed airdrops every round as a primary objective were clearly influenced by the tropes of the BR genre at the time. People still approached these games with a last man standing mentality. And the same can be said for Hunt Showdown. Originally developed in 2014 as Hunt Horrors of the Gilded Age, a third-person co-op monster hunting game, Hunt is the first of many in this list whose origins bear little resemblance to where they ended up. Hunt was, and to this day remains, the odd one out. Your character, Hunter, bears all these special occult abilities, can die and be resurrected over and over, and the game's fast objective-based PvP provides a hero fantasy much closer to Battle Royale than players coughing and limping their way to extract points in Tarkov did. And while Tarkov had cordoned locations, fixed extract points, a ticking time clock, permadeath, and loss of character, these were all actually, at the time, placeholder decisions. EFT originally was pitched as a persistent open-world survival experience like DayZ or Stalker. The map timers and extraction points were a simple stopgap, while Battlestate Games figured the larger experience out. Fast forwarding 10 years later, spoiler alert, they never did, but it's interesting to see how Hunt, in contrast at this time, launched with these design elements purposefully. Regardless, these elements were working. People bored with the comparatively slow pace of open-world survival were attracted to these games, where every round was a staked bet. Unlike a BR, if you won, you kept your spoils. The era of hype was in full swing. Now, this video won't follow every little thing that Hunt or Tarkov did over the years, but from 2016 to 2020 or so, they were the only real entries in the genre, while the Battle Royale craze was hitting heights the likes of which the gaming world as a whole had never seen. A small Venn diagram of games in this new genre began to appear, not quite a BR, but not quite a survival game either. Some will come to know well, and many utterly forgotten. Like Hood, Outlaws, and Legends, a game apparently no one remembers, more a hero-based objective shooter, the experience of attacking a key objective in stages, fighting a boss to obtain the key win condition item, and fighting other players to extract with it feels interestingly predictive of ideas we'd see pop up increasingly in the following decade. EFT really began to pop off in 2019 with a meteoric rise in attention from Twitch audiences, and it cemented itself as the apex of PC FPS difficulty, the most frustrating and rewarding game you'd ever play. Companies who had had their eyes on it even in the early days now saw it as the model, and with PC gaming exploding during the doldrums of the COVID pandemic, it sat poised as this obvious key to the next big thing. Whatever this game was doing, it was different, it was attractive, we need to do that. If only these developers had known what they were getting themselves into. The genre had established core concepts: looting, to some degree, a ticking clock, and importance to progression. When you win time and time again, that needs to mean something. And of course, in order to win, to survive, you need to extract. But it wasn't that simple. Tarkov had only gotten more complex as time went on, new maps, more complex and challenging AI, a karma system, an ever-growing catalog of quests and loot. But big publishers didn't have time for all that. They needed a hit, and they needed it now. They wanted things to be simple. And so, we saw the first AAA entries. I don't say this lightly. Of the games that I've played on this list, Battlefield's Hazard Zone is almost certainly the worst excuse for an extraction shooter, but it didn't need to be. Essentially a stripped-down version of the Hunt Showdown style objective model mixed with something like Headhunter from Halo Reach. You looted these data drives, the bounty objective basically, which you used a scanner to locate, much like Hunt's Dark Side. The more drives you extracted with, the better profit to buy weapons. But that was basically it. There was no real sense of progression round to round, no pie-in-the-sky thing that you're yearning for. Hazard Zone was essentially the literal mechanics of extraction made into a mode, then tacked onto an already rushed and incomplete larger game. Hazard Zone's maps were literally the same Battlefield multiplayer maps you'd play Conquest on, a complete opposite to the painstakingly curated bespoke maps of Tarkov or Hunt. Not only a disappointing attempt at the genre, but very likely one that took major development resources away from the already strained Battlefield 2042, potentially leading to the entire game's catastrophically bad launch. But hey, at least they weren't alone. Now, to be fair, DMZ by comparison wasn't all bad. Essentially Call of Duty Warzone without a Battle Royale-esque circle and with extractions instead of last man standing, it contained some legitimately fun ideas harkening back to the genre's origins. The weapon case, namely, an extractable objective giving tangible permanent account rewards like skins or charms guarded by a difficult boss, sometimes in a special quarantined area requiring a gas mask. It was very reminiscent of the contaminated zones that you'd find in Division's Dark Zone. The real problem with DMZ and Hazard Zone as well was, like, why play this? Going back to Richard Bartle's suggestion in 2001, the Badlands, the key point of that idea was an area containing rewards and experiences not found elsewhere. The weapon case was on the right path, sure, and COD players did play the mode purely to get one, but why play the rest of the mode when all the freeform fun and excitement of Warzone was right there? It became clear that this genre was not a mode like BR. It needed full-fledged experiences. It needed actual games. And for better or worse, we started to get them. The cycle is still one of the most interesting as well as one of the most inherently flawed. Its killer mechanic, the cycle, was legitimately brilliant, at least in concept. The ticking clock was not removed but made optional. Every 30 minutes a storm would descend on the persistent map, making outdoors areas uninhabitable and resetting loot and PvE enemies, the Blood Moon from Zelda Breath of the Wild, if you will. Except you didn't have to leave. You could ride the storm out if you wanted inside of a shelter, staying in a map instance for hours. The most daring could actually brave the outdoors, collecting rare electrically charged items only found outdoors in the storm. Due to its persistent 6-hour map cycles, matching time was non-existent in the Cycle Frontier, making playing round-to-round quick and accessible. While there were other fun concepts, map objectives and puzzles, holdovers from its origins as just the Cycle, the much more objective BR-like game Frontier started as, that's where the positives really ended, in my opinion. While cheating became rampant and fixes came too little too late, I really think that it came down to the moment-to-moment gameplay. The game just didn't feel good or satisfying to play. Poorly designed loot drops, questing, and unbalanced PvE made the game, intended to be a more casual and accessible Tarkov, actually a harder grind to get on your feet than the latter game. And because of how shields and damage were balanced, a well-kitted team was almost impossible to defeat for a low-geared new player. By the time the sheen wore off and the player base had dwindled, there was almost nothing they could have done to bring those people back. Marauders can be seen as a warning for the dangerous game of early access, as well as how hard it is to make a game in this genre work. Providing a very unique double extraction loop, you entered a map in your spaceship, then infiltrated other ships in a breaching pod, fought through them, looted, extracted from that ship back to your ship, and then extracted your ship entirely out of the map to survive. It was as unique as any game on this list, with a fun and stylish diesel punk World War II Cold War and space sort of aesthetic to boot. It also understood how the lure of tasty loot behind tough challenges can make a game's frustration be the key to resulting satisfaction. And that frustration might have been a big part of the problem. See, for how much potential Marauders had, it had all the time sink and grind of a game like Tarkov, and was nowhere near as complete, even years after its initial alpha. By comparison to the greats, it was a hard sell, with an even more niche and specific aesthetic, both a blessing and curse. I personally had been waiting for the game to be updated a bit more before trying it out, and by the time that I would have been ready, the game was all but dead. But speaking of dead, it's literally in the name of this one. Dead Rop. I'm sorry, you name your game something goofy and I'm gonna make fun of it. It was basically dead, well, I would say on arrival, but it never actually arrived. The first ever VES, or vertical extraction shooter they called it, which as far as I can tell literally meant it was an extraction shooter oriented vertically, like you moved up. I would say that this seems interesting in concept, except for that people have played it, and it was apparently a fundamentally poorly thought out idea. The higher you got, the higher ground you had, the easier it was to just shoot down at people moving up the tower. And I never actually thought of this until I watched gameplay of it. Our eyes are horizontally aligned, right? So are the screens that we play games on. So it's just sort of visually disorienting, almost sickening, to be looking up all the time, especially on a 16:9 screen. Poorly thought out as well was its connection to NFTs. Imagine an extraction shooter like Tarkov, but the stuff you extracted had actual value on the blockchain, said Dr. Disrespect, the game's co-founder, and what he apparently didn't imagine that everyone else did is how that fact, real monetary value tied to loot, instantly makes this game a magnet for cheating. Every other game in the genre's Achilles heel times 1,000. Announced in 2022, in development hell for years with almost zero progress and with Dr. Disrespect's name forever associated with it, Dead Rop would be a pointless, if not hilarious, stain on the legacy of the genre, if not for one detail. As far as I can tell, it was the first game to actively market itself with the words extraction shooter. But it was not the last. Now, Rainbow Six Extraction is not actually an extraction shooter, as far as I can tell, much closer to a classic co-op or roguelike, and funnily enough, quite similar to the game Hunt originally was supposed to be. It's on this list for one reason. By the time R6 Extraction was announced, that word no longer inspired hype or excitement. It brought groans of disappointment. Simply put, games like Tarkov or Hunt were exciting in 2016 because they brought forward something new, a feeling, a setting, a style of gameplay that no one had ever experienced, with pointed specificity. Not because entering, looting, and extracting was in and of itself intriguing. And it was at this time that another Ubisoft-published team would be starting development on a new project, under the same name as the one that kicked it all off years ago, The Division Heartland. Where Heartland started and where it ended up are something we'll come back to. But people were desperate for new experiences to get them immersed like they were in the classics years ago. And with those original games still being the only curated experiences doing that in 2022, things were looking a bit dire for this genre which once showed such potential. Well, it was only gonna get worse. As anyone who followed the day before should know, it was never supposed to be anything close to an extraction shooter. Well, it was, technically. You loaded into a location, you collected loot, fought, died, or extracted. But calling this a game at all is almost insulting to the medium. Marketed as a groundbreaking MMO zombie survival experience with unprecedented realism and immersion, hundreds of thousands of people were somehow swindled into believing that this scam would be an actual game, despite glaring red flags in its marketing media. Possibly one of the most public failures in this general area of games, but certainly not the biggest. For a game that almost no one has played, as it was cancelled before ever being released publicly, Hyenas is a fascinating story. At face value, one of the many attempts at Fortnite-ifying the exfil genre. It did not actually start that way. After shipping Alien Isolation and Halo Wars 2, Creative Assembly pitched the game to Sega sometime in 2017 as a PvPvE experience inspired by PUBG, Destiny, and Tarkov, among other things. Set around abandoned space stations, players would infiltrate zero-G environments guarded by AI robot sentries to break into and loot vaults and caches of old-world goods. Its visual style, originally conceptualized by artists such as Kunrong Yap, the game was going for a gritty Firefly Han Solo-esque lovable rogue analog future tech aesthetic, and apparently around 2019, Neil Blomkamp, director of District 9, visited and gave feedback to the studio on the game's direction. If this is all sounding weirdly unsettlingly familiar, yeah, that's what I thought too. Anyway, ex-Creative Assembly devs have shared that from the get-go, the project lacked any kind of solid creative direction, and a major game engine switch set the team back years. It took an entirely different neon game show aesthetic filled with Sega assets. It switched from a premium model to free-to-play. Apparently at this time, Sega executives were throwing money at this and other projects and hovering in person over the studio to an unprecedented degree. These same studio sources believe that Hyenas was eventually Sega's most expensive project ever, with a budget likely over $70 million. Never finding a solid direction, floundering in poorly received tests, by the time the project was finally cancelled, devs were almost relieved, if it weren't for the toll the project's failure had on those involved. Quote, "I'm not angry with Sega for canceling," says one dev. "I'm angry with the leadership, for the people above them, for not dealing with them. Many people at Creative Assembly with no connection to the Hyenas project at all lost their jobs from the resulting layoffs." And, well, this was a problem not remotely unique to an extraction shooter project. 2022 to 2023 was a terrible time to be working in the games industry, and that stagnation was felt by fans of shooter games. There's nothing new to play, people would say, and it wouldn't subside for some time. The Fortnite bubble was beginning to pop as well. A game like Hawked, entering early access in 2022, was still trying to ride that wave of cartoony third-person shooter aesthetics. At best, it was a casually sort of fun extraction looter shooter, but for its target audience, for fans of games like Fortnite, why wouldn't you just, play Fortnite instead? On the other side, even EFT was losing some of its hype as well. Controversy after controversy, the final game still seemingly years from completion. And hey, it was 5 years in to an early access cycle, so some slowdown was inevitable no matter what. The market for these kind of games was still there, but doing Tarkov but simpler was not gonna cut it. Things needed to go in a completely different direction. Sometimes to do something new, you need to do something old. And while Tarkov took dungeon crawler RPG mechanics and made them feel real, Quasimorph did the opposite and went back to basics. A top-down extraction roguelike RPG with turn-based combat, say that 10 times fast. You still lose everything when you die and extract to keep your loot, but rather than twitchy one-shot and you're dead realism, this whole affair was slowed way down. Methodical, chess-like decision-making takes as much from the extraction genre's inspirations, Stalker, The Division, as it does from their inspirations, XCOM, Ultima, going all the way back to the multi-user dungeons of the 1970s. Zero Sievert might look similar at face value, but it really isn't. A much more reasonable game to call Tarkov but top-down, the game retains all of that punishing, grindy loop and necessity of quick decision-making of a hardcore FPS extraction shooter, but with an ultra-simplified presentation. Aim and shoot, move carefully, loot when the looting is good. The Stalker influence is clearly felt here too, doing wildlife and survival gameplay in a way that Tarkov never did. Both of these featuring procedurally generated maps, both entirely PvE experiences, this was where the interest in extraction games without PvP really began to bloom, but still wrapped around this very Tarkov-influenced shooter-based loop. And if Quasimorph and Zero Sievert seemed to harken back to the origins, things were about to turn even more old school. When audiences first saw this game, Tarkov with swords was probably on everyone's mind, but Dark and Darker is really the only game on this list I truly believe might still have been made exactly as it was in a world where EFT never happened. A hybrid between a dungeon crawl, roguelike, and classical RPG, it shares that similar DNA with everything else we've discussed, from Dungeons & Dragons to DayZ. While class-based, cleric, wizard, etc., its looting mechanics feel very Tarkov, or is it just that they feel like every other MMORPG ever made? D&D, Dark and Darker that is, brought back the circle mechanics of BR and early exfil shooters as well, and featured awkward, clunky, and slow-paced yet satisfying melee combat. Obfuscation of the senses due to the low-light environments of a dungeon meant that sound was hugely important to gameplay legibility. These adjectives, awkward, janky, low fidelity, can be applied to basically everything in the game. At face value, it might not have been up the alley of many Tarkov or Hunt fans looking for more of that crisp and realistic feel. And Dungeonborn seemed poised to fill that exact gap. The two medieval dark fantasy entries in the Extraction family having released back-to-back is interesting, to say the least. Dungeonborn was at its core almost exactly the same game as Dark and Darker with a fresher coat of paint, and players initially praised quality of life changes over D&D as well as a smoother and more satisfying gameplay experience overall. We might never know why, but things just sort of fell apart in ways that now feel familiar for this genre. Cheating became rampant, mass teaming ruined the experience for solo players, and promises by the developers fell flat, with communication becoming sparser and sparser to the end. I honestly think at this point that putting extraction in your game's title is literally a curse. Originally marketed as just Level 0, an asymmetrical style PvP game perhaps most akin to a mix between Alan Wake and Dead by Daylight, this game seems to have suddenly completely shifted direction in direct response to the announcement of Beautiful Light, a game that we'll come back to in a second, and adopted many of its qualities. Originally, Level 0 saw scientists solving puzzles, attempting to escape an underground installation, and defending themselves against Demogorgon-esque monsters controlled by by other players. The Extraction rebrand saw the game turn to Beautiful Light's three-pronged PvPvP style. The scientists then replaced with black-clad operators now gunning for each other. As many other games in this list should have shown, trend chasing doesn't go over well in this genre, and outside of an initial period of paid influencer marketing-driven hype, followed by changes to its balancing and modes alienating what audience it had, the game quickly petered off to be cancelled and shut down just 2 weeks after its official launch on Steam. But if Level 0 Extraction was trend chasing at a breakneck pace, Beautiful Light is the opposite. It is, besides Hunt Showdown, to this day the only game being developed in the Extraction subgenre which focuses on objective-based gameplay, rather than that classic collect loot and build up your character loot. Originally inspired by live-action SCP films and asymmetrical PvP games such as Natural Selection, its PvPvP, operators versus operators with player-controlled monster against them all, is intriguing itself, but its diegetic computer hacking and PDA systems are equally if not more engaging, having played with them extensively. While it's a very ambitious project created by a very small team, BL has one of the most open dev cycles in the history of indie games, so go give the devs a shout on Discord or Twitch, or just watch my 2 deep dive videos on the game if you want to learn more about it. Also, in the just watch my video on it category, although chances are by numbers you maybe already have, Forever Winter is, of the games you can still actively play on this list, one of the most unique in premise and certainly the most stylish. Another PvE-only entry, FW is a reverse power fantasy, where the scavenger players find routes through a perpetual war between mechanized factions on the surface of a scarred Earth. FW provides a unique example of intense cinematic extraction gameplay, not at all reliant on PvP. The gameplay of FW is still flawed in many ways. Don't let the incredible visual direction fool you. This game is being developed by a very small team. All of the game's music and sound design are done by the same guy, for instance. But as a true example of how to do early access right, the game has been updated and improved an astonishing amount since EA release. Its scope and direction changing in quite interesting ways in the process, by the way. And a game with true heart like this, I think will always garner a cult community of followers wherever it goes. PvE games in this genre tend to rely on twisting the extraction experience to stand out. This game did the opposite. So if I wanted to explain to someone what this genre was at its core, I would legitimately tell them to play Whole. Possibly the simplest game on this list. You are given zero information besides how to shoot and unjam your gun, dropped into an ambiguous, nondescript liminal office block, and told to survive. Whole's intensity comes from its opacity. You never know what's around any corner, and yet it's clear from context what you should do, where you should or shouldn't go. Received extremely well, Whole proved that not only is PvP not actually required for an intense or satisfying exfil shooter, but mechanical complexity or hardcore simulation is neither. So what is required? What is this genre even about? Do you need PvP, permadeath, loot? Do you even need shooting? On that note, it's time for some honorable mentions, games that I believe don't actually count as extraction shooters, but are adjacent with shared elements that people seem inherently drawn to. There are the classic co-op survival experiences. Left 4 Dead, of course, you do literally extract out of the map at the end to win in that one. Recent entries like Vermintide, Dark Tide, and Helldivers show how intense and fun the experience of infiltrating and exfiltrating from a hostile zone can be. Deep Rock Galactic and Warframe, in drastically different ways, involve attacking a specific location for loot and then getting out. Payday the Heist and GTFO focus around both sequential puzzles and being forced to stay in a specific area to complete an objective before extracting, the intensity of tower defense in a horde shooter context. Lethal Company takes the get X thing and get out loot, but strips the PvP and PvE away. The awe and intensity of exploring a strange procedural world in extraction shooters or roguelikes, but not falling back on that crutch of combat to make that experience exciting. Every one of these honorable mentions, however, is missing one key element: true permadeath, where the world persists but you do not, where the stuff you bring in is lost when you die, and if you survive, you keep that exact stuff for the next run. Trying to simplify that formula, it obviously didn't work. So what about total immersion? Ghosts of Tabor and Contractors Showdown Exfil Zone Both of these games actually have their merits and drawbacks. Both contain arcadey renditions of the extraction formula to some degree. Some seem to think that Tabor is the more immersive of the two, while Exfil Zone is more approachable, more polished. Neither of them have really grabbed much of a huge audience, but well, it is VR, so the audience is already way smaller than any other platform. Both of them do, however, use the medium to elevate aspects of the genre in really fun ways, such as actual three-dimensional inventory management, requiring players to physically, literally pick up loot and fit it into their backpack, etc. Giving tactile hands-on realism to the complexity of Tarkov's mechanics is actually really cool, and it makes those moments feel less tedious and more necessary. But if these games are basically VR Tarkov, what about getting as far from Tarkov as physically possible? Well, I will just say, if you've ever heard of either of these next two titles, you can come get some candy after class. Synduality Echoes of Ada. This one was part of Bandai Namco's huge Synduality multimedia project that they've been developing since 2023, involving a novel, a manga series, an anime series, and a mech-based PvP extraction shooter. Echoes of Ada seems to have centered around that PvP-style zone, going back to stuff like The Division, fight AI and player alike in a cordoned location to pick up some loot for upgrades, etc. From what I've read, the core experience just really doesn't offer anything special, and the most promising and interesting aspects of the game are locked behind hours of tedious grinding, exactly the type of thing that kills a game in this genre. You'll have to take others' words for it, because the player count is down to the double digits less than a year after launch. But that seems like a roaring success in comparison to the next project. The Day Before may have shut down just 4 days after launch, but we'll likely never know its actual budget. Unfortunately, that cannot be said for Seekers of Skyvale. In concept, an extremely unique idea, an extraction MOBA, developed by former BioWare, Blizzard, and Riot. Initially funded by investors with $32.5 million as a social co-op game, so-called, in 2019, a major shift took place sometime around 2023, leading the game to what it became. Despite being one of the more original ultra-niche ideas in the space, or perhaps because of exactly that, Skyvale hit a max CCU of 384 players at launch and was shuttered only 2 weeks later. It's fascinating to see the amount of development effort and funding that went into supposed live service high concept extraction games in the early 2020s, all to be added to the list of things with supposed promise in a genre gamers were becoming more and more skeptical of. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking being The Division Heartland. There's nothing worse than a cancelled game. Never being able to get the chance to set foot in a world that you've yearned for is a special kind of disappointment. What started as a Battle Royale mode for Division 2 in 2019 became, by its 2021 reveal, a free-to-play full-release title with both PvPvE and solely PvE modes. It evolved some of the original Division's ideas. Instead of set contaminated areas, zones of contamination would move dynamically throughout the open world. Players would need to be wary of their mask durability and manage hydration, along with other survival elements during the game's constant day and night cycle. By late 2022, the game had gone through several quiet delays as well as rounds of testing. We might never know exactly what went wrong at Red Storm, but the lack of clear direction coming down from the top can have helped. When Heartland was eventually cancelled by Ubisoft along with a swath of other projects, the resources were apparently in part redirected towards bigger opportunities such as XDefiant. So, yeah. But Heartland's cancellation was hopefully the last of the big-budget AAA extraction letdowns of the 2020s. With Escape from Tarkov supposedly churning towards a 1.0 release and several major AAA extraction shooter projects announced by the end of 2024, the feeling of stagnation was finally waning a bit, giving way to a sort of passive skepticism. Maybe there's something cool on the horizon, but we aren't going to hold our breaths about it. And that's when the big boys began to show up. But in order to understand how this era started, we have to go back a couple years for a second. Because one of the most major players in the modern age of extraction games staked its claim quietly in 2022. Arena Breakout. No, not Infinite. Arena Breakout, the first real mobile extraction experience at face value, almost a direct copy of Escape from Tarkov, down to complex food and drink animations, hit zones, and armor mechanics right on your smartphone. Arena Breakout launched as the ultimate hype period for Escape from Tarkov was cooling down as the era of stagnation, if you will, began, and it gave casual fans a lead into the extraction genre, those fans then potentially picking up Tarkov itself on PC if they were hooked enough. That last part is possibly why Battlestate Games paid little attention to it at the time, but maybe they should have. Fast forward to spring 2024, and Arena Breakout Infinite was announced as a fully fledged, from the ground up PC version of the same game, the first major direct competitor to Escape from Tarkov, free to play. And if you were in this community at the time, you know what happened next. Tarkov's developers were still already on the back foot at this time, still reeling from several other controversies, and then they released the Unheard Edition. I won't delve too deep into this, but the gist is that it was an outrageously expensive limited edition of the game, which included features and items that seemed to directly go back on earlier promises they'd made to the game's many loyal backers for years. Well, Arena Breakout Infinite developer Morfun saw their shot and they took it. With ABI going into beta the next month, the social media accounts of Arena Breakout began taking shots at Battlestate Games, who themselves fired back, accusing them of plagiarizing EFT. Long story short, Arena Breakout Infinite is and forever will be associated with this controversy, especially as they continue taking shots at Tarkov to this day. Personally, I think this is all extremely petty. Arena Breakout, if you've actually played it, which I have quite a bit, really isn't much like Tarkov at all once you get beyond the surface level mechanics. The game's loop is actually completely different, with a much greater focus on a cyclical, non-wiping, PvP-driven economy, easily legible gameplay, and game modes dividing players by gear value and loot potential. They're just different games, which different kinds of players might enjoy for different reasons. Around the same time though, the second big-budget Chinese extraction shooter was heading towards release, Delta Force, a successor to the Novalogic-developed series from the late 1990s. Originally titled Delta Force Hawk Ops, okay, personal aside here, this will never be proven, but I have a huge sneaking suspicion that they changed the name of this one specifically because the Hawk Tua meme had just been the biggest thing on the internet a couple months before Delta Force went into beta. I will never be able to prove that, but I swear that's what happened. Anyway, Delta Force contrasts every other exfil shooter in that its combat is largely dictated by its cast of hero-based classes, which kind of grenades, gadgets, and defensive kit you have access to come not from the looted gear you run, but from abilities tied to character class. The game focuses less on a direct PvP-driven economy and more on the open map dynamic interplay between PvE encounters, events triggered by both players and AI, and on minigame puzzles and challenges that you can choose to partake in mid-round. That being said, game feel-wise, ABI and Delta Force really are two sides of the same coin. While both gained a solid player base on PC, largely due to being free, they didn't blow up in the way Tarkov had back in the day. The genre still hadn't seen its modern mainstream hit. As of the writing of this video, Marathon should have been released almost exactly 1 month ago. At one point, it was considered the AAA extraction title with the greatest potential. Now, it's possibly the one fighting the steepest uphill battle to success. Focused on class-based gameplay similar to Delta Force, albeit with far more free-form modification based on kit and equipment, Marathon seeks to create a space for itself focused on competitive team play and shooting skill. In Bungie fashion, every weapon, item, and ability is balanced to be overpowered in its own way in the right hands, in contrast to the start from nothing and build yourself up loop of a game like Tarkov. Marathon's multi-pronged character build crafting harkens back to the complex gameplay modifiers of roguelikes. With certain augments come hyper-specific utility. You lose your augments and you're back to square one. The art style and direction is by far the most unique of the AAA PvP extraction games, but it's impossible to talk Marathon without controversy. When during the public alpha, a graphic designer noticed her work being used without permission as decals in-game. Even the art theft controversy aside though, that alluring and hypnotically mysterious clean tone sold in the initial reveal trailer was not in line with what players saw in its initial gameplay reveal. Bungie has made it clear that fixing all of these issues with the game, art included, are priority one going forward, and I believe that the delay was the best thing to happen to this game. We'll only have to see if that belief is vindicated. This one came absolutely out of nowhere. A stalker-like extraction shooter developed by the people behind War Thunder? Well, in practice, it works better than you'd expect. Many games, everything from Tarkov itself to Beautiful Light, have been called Stalker but with PvP. This is the only one that I think truly deserves that moniker. With the DNA calling back to those MMOs of yesteryear, find loot which permanently modifies your character with ability buffs, as well as a world filled with by far the strangest and least predictable PvE encounters the genre has to offer, Active Matter is a sandbox of creative and extremely threatening anomalies the player is as likely to perish to as rival humans. Active Matter is one of the few games I honestly think that, if PvP doesn't work out for them, could be slightly modified to be a purely co-op or PvE experience and still be quite entertaining. But while PvE extraction games have come and gone over the years, the most successful one was maybe the least expected. You'd be forgiven for thinking this is one of those $2 joke asset flip games based on the title, but that would massively undersell Escape from Duckov. Despite its name, EFD is a great game in its own right, truly the peak potential of what a game like Zero Sieverts started. A simple, casual presentation with deeper, more engaging gameplay underneath. Explore several maps, progress your character through base building and skill acquisition, fight bosses, and of course vacuum up all the juicy loot to your heart's content. The game thrives because it actually feels like it wants you to play it. Since this is single player, you can change difficulty, pause the game. Essentially, it doesn't expect you to take it as seriously as a full-time job to have some casual fun, because, I mean, just look at it. Hey, the response to the game speaks for itself, and even the creators of EFT seem impressed with it as well. If you told me in 2020 that a single-player non-PvP top-down duck-type game would be maybe the second most popular extraction shooter of all time, I would have head-eyed you. Okay, maybe that's a bit extreme, but still. The extraction shooter's origins in hardcore one-shot and you're done for stress-inducing PvP, maybe they've been more detrimental to the genre's success this whole time, rather than the key to it. The question, the problem of PvP. It's one that goes back decades and decades. From the dungeon crawlers of the 80s and 90s to the battlegrounds of today, every game requires newbies to survive. People have to want to play a game that they aren't good at yet when others are. And if the only people left are those who've made the game their second life, even those people aren't having that much fun. There needs to be balance. And in 2025, I think we might have found it. Now, I don't want to jump the gun. Despite its astonishing success and growing player numbers by the week, Arc Raiders did come out less than a month ago as of this writing. But this did not happen in a vacuum. The immersion, the sound, the animations, the visuals, they all got people in the door, and how important these aspects all are to Arc's meteoric rise are all subjects of prior videos that I've made over the last year. But many people have gotten in the door to games just to turn around and walk right back out. It's what I think might make them stay this time that I find much more interesting, and it all comes down to ancient ideas in game design. A game must have loss, of course, but also ways to win. In a game like Tarkov, it's always been material, the Kappa container, a way to keep things safe when on raids, to loot more things to go on more raids, a vicious cycle. In Hunt Showdown, that capstone goal is the ability to prestige. To start over, you get a skin for it. And now, with Escape from Tarkov 1.0, it's the story. You want to escape Tarkov. A game like the upcoming Hunger takes things in an interesting different direction, essentially by making its progression both linear and branching. It extends the possible goals for the player tenfold. There's the main story, the linear progression of quest lines, all ranking up your trust with traders to allow you to climb the ladder of the chateau, the physical and metaphorical hierarchy of the game's hub world. And then there's the build crafting, the skill tree of your character, spec yourself into looting or stealth, heavy melee weapons, rifles, or a mix of several things, all of course with the constant necessity of looting, fighting very difficult yet manageable PvE enemies, finding weapons, defending yourself from others, and yet with all these options, with all these ways to play, the goal is still to improve your player character, to let you do what you want exactly how you want it. And often, what do you want? PvP. Just to fight others to your heart's content, in the way that you want, when you want to do it. And therein lies one of the biggest issues with the genre. And this is why one simple thing Arc did really stood out to me. The Trials system is a ranked leaderboard at face value. You compete with others to get more points doing set in-game tasks, do damage to this type of enemy, loot this kind of thing. It rewards players for doing base-level starter activities on a competitive stage. Every week, your position on the leaderboard decides if you rank up or not. The higher your rank at the end of the season, the better permanent rewards you get. It seems complicated at first, but it really isn't. It's a high score. A high score applied to doing basically anything the devs decide. By being better at trials, you get tangible rewards. You get to compete with yourself and others, not in being better at the game and crushing others in combat, but literally by beating your high score in the same simple, boring task someone who picked up the game yesterday would be doing, evening out that play experience for everyone. And the brilliant thing about trials, you can just not do them. It's a choice. an opt-in like PvP, except unlike PvP, a player opting into doing this can benefit themselves as well as everyone else simultaneously. The players who do engage with it, they aren't getting bored once they've done their quests and kitting up to go crush poor players just trying to get by. They might even avoid PvP so as not to risk their huge high score in, like, looting fruit baskets or whatever. Because this system is on a cycle, PvP in the game will inherently wax and wane, and the best players out there will continue to engage with the whole game, the whole map, not just the 15 square foot area where the highest tier loot is, like in many games in the genre. And that means that some little guy who just picked up the game yesterday might get that loot instead, and now they're hooked. New players are inherently immature. So writes Richard Bartle in his 2001 article. The game needs to nurture them so that they may grow, but that relationship goes both ways. Without new players willing to try and experience out, a game won't grow either. Designers have a dilemma to solve, he writes 25 years ago. Will they allow permadeath of player characters in PvP, increasing that tension, that reward, but risking player retention, the ability for a game to expand? Well, today we ask similar, if not identical, questions. Is this game too hard, too punishing, not hard enough? Does it help the player along, ruining all the struggle and subsequent victory? Does it leave too much up to the player, leading them to feel lost, their time wasted? Over the next few years, we'll find out what they decide, he says. Except, we never did. Game devs, publishers, hell, gamers themselves still barely know what they want. But at least, after a decade or more of pain, after seeing everything that's been tried, what worked and what didn't, we might just be that much closer to finding an answer. I'm Riloe and I like to talk about stuff that I find interesting. Hope you learned something today. Subscribe if you haven't yet. And I will catch you very soon.